Hey, good morning, Choice Residential. Hope your day's off to a wonderful start. Today, I want to talk about what happens when you're a listing agent and a buyer strolls in who doesn't have an agent. Because the reality is, you should rarely, if ever, be representing the seller and the buyer in a transaction. So it's one thing to be a dual agent where you represent one party and another agent in our firm represents the other party, and you two act as designated dual agents. But there shouldn't be many circumstances where you're actually a dual agent and the only agent in the transaction. So you're representing the buyer, you're representing the seller. So here's how you handle that. If it's your listing and a buyer shows up and they don't have an agent, well, of course, you should be going through working with real estate agents. You should explain to them that they have the right to have an agent. But if they want to make an offer and they don't want to have a different agent representing them, then they are an unrepresented buyer. There's no reason for you to go into dual agency in this situation, because then you've given up all of your representation benefits for your seller, all for a buyer who you just met, right? Who just entered the equation and they didn't have an agent. So you simply have them be an unrepresented buyer in the transaction. And all they need to do in that case is sign the working with real estate agents brochure, and you're going to have them initial the seller sub-agency, meaning that you represent the seller in the transaction, not them. And that's all you need. There's no other documentation that you need for an unrepresented buyer. You can help them prepare the offer. You can't give them advice. Of course, they're not your client. And you need to remember that you are representing the seller, but you can prepare the paperwork based on what they want to offer. You can help them coordinate a closing. If they ask for a recommendation on a home inspector, you could give them a couple, 2, 3 different names there and remind them that it's their choice on who they hire. They need to conduct their own research, but you're happy to provide some contacts if that would help them. So definitely make sure you're navigating it that way. We've seen many times where listing agents have just represented the buyer as become a dual agent when they really didn't need to. So make sure you're thinking that part of it through. Now, you may say, well, what happens, Brian, if I have a listing and I already have a buyer that I'm working with, and that buyer happens to want to buy my listing? Well, that's one of the rare situations where you potentially, maybe, could represent both that buyer and the seller in the transaction, but I would highly encourage you, even in that scenario, not to do it, to simply refer that buyer out to another agent in the office in order to make an offer on your listing. If the buyer gets the house, then that other agent will represent them through closing. If that buyer does not get the house, that buyer comes back to you. And if they do complete the purchase on your listing, then you would simply get a referral feedback from the agent that you referred them to, probably in the neighborhood of 50%, since you provided that client, they wrote an offer on one property and went through to closing. So I'm happy to help you sort through all the details when these situations come up, because while it may make perfect sense to you right now, I'm fully aware that in the heat of these moments, sometimes clarity isn't always right there for you. So always reach out to me so that I can help you navigate it the best way that's going to remove the most liability from you and the firm as well, and make sure that your clients are getting the best service possible. If you have any questions about this or experiences you'd like to share, put them in the comments below or reach out to me directly. Take care, everybody.